Okay, willkommen till Troll Talk, Trolls in Arts and Literature During Times of Conflict. I am your presenter, Britte, Rasmussen, Marsh. Thank you for being here tonight. And also, happy Veterans Day. I'm so glad that you have taken the time to come be here at Nordic Northwest tonight. If you like what you see, you can contact me at wetrollinfo@gmail.com. This is the second of 3 troll talks. There will be a third one on the 25th of this month that is going to be about trolls and Norwegian immigration in small towns across America. Before we get started, I also want to thank my host, Nordic Northwest, for hosting me once again, and dedicate this presentation to a special group of people. I always like to take a moment to dedicate each of my presentations based on what the content is about. This presentation is about 20th century writers and artists of Northern Europe who experienced some of the most heinous conflicts that history reflects back to us today through literature, paintings, photography, diaries, and records. Conflicts such as the rise of fascism, war, and genocide. I want to dedicate this presentation to the writers and artists who live in conflict zones today, whether it be a hospital in Gaza or a classroom in Gresham, and record what's happening to their community through the medium of their craft. May we listen to their stories, learn from past mistakes, and act accordingly to protect one another as kin. The content that I'm presenting tonight comes from my historical series, Trolls: A Retrospective, which looks like this from a bird's eye perspective. You do not need to read all of this. This is just to show you that there is a lot of content, because the history of trolls has depth and breadth. It is as long as human history, longer perhaps. And so the series is divided into 4 troll eras: the early, mid, modern, and contemporary eras. Tonight, you will hear content specially curated from the modern troll era, 1910 to 1950 Common Era. So here we go. Trolls in art and literature in times of conflict. The presentation is very visual. If you'd like to come closer and sit on the floor, you are so welcome to do so. Here's our agenda. The run of the show is approximately an hour and 15 minutes with no intermission and includes 2 pieces of multimedia. To center our experience, an essential quote. Monsters are real, and ghosts are real too. They live inside us, and sometimes they win. Stephen King. Our story begins where trolls began, the Nordic countries of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and Finland. I trust you'll know from prior experiences with trolls that their origin story stems from the Old Norse mythology of the Viking Age, and that trolls survived Christian conversion of Scandinavia by going underground, finding refuge through the oral traditions of common folk living in the Norwegian countryside. Generationally, troll tales were passed down for centuries, until one day in the early 1800s, during an era of romantic nationalism, folklorists from the cities ventured out into the woods, seeking to publish stories that reflected an authentic Nordic past. And so we read about them, these beings that were any or all or none of these qualities in the natural world: unexplainable, magical, mysterious, large, small, male, female, capable of gender shifting, real, imagined, other with a capital O, misshapen, strong, dumb, capable of shape-shifting, frightening, chatty, seductive, solitary, social, desirous of gold and precious gems, hidden, in plain sight, polycephalous, this means having multiple heads, likes beer, hates church bells, hungry for flesh, helpful, disruptive, kidnappers of princesses, stickler for terms and rules. But now that Europe entered the first half of the 20th century, which was dominated by the ravages of war, what role would trolls play in the conflicts to come? Would they have relevance at all? And if so, on the other side of World War I and II, would trolls retain the mythical and folkloric characteristics for which they'd become known? The year was 1914. On one side was the Triple Entente of France, Great Britain, and Russia, which included the Finnish people since they'd been usurped by the Russian Empire 100 years prior. On the other was the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. While the battles of the Great War were waged on the soils of mainland Europe, the Nordic countries of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland maintained a status of neutrality throughout. Neutrality in Scandinavia didn't mean unaffected. There were food shortages, internal social unrest, turnover of ruling parties, and other material ramifications. However, for the sake of fully appreciating this conflict, let's zoom out of the north to consider other countries who took a decisive stance to join the war. Great Britain. When news of England's declaration of war against the Triple Alliance was announced across campus at Oxford University, a young student named Ronald watched his classmates celebrate this in the square. What a strange reaction to the onset of war, he thought. He opted to burrow deeper into his studies. He lived for the fictional worlds that he created on his own terms, heavily influenced by his lifelong love of mythologies of the Norse gods, giants, and mischief makers, which of course included our subject, trolls. In his notebooks, you'd find whole languages he'd invented on his own, such as Animalic, Nevbosh, Nafarin, as well as a network of legends he told the stories of the people who spoke them. He was right on the precipice of creating his most sophisticated language yet, one whose phonology drew heavily from the Finnish language, but whose script was an entirely novel system that existed only by his own hand. And this language would come to be called Quenya, the language of the elves. You can see Quenya creeping down the vine on the right as time passes in this tale. By now, I'm sure some of you have probably guessed the identity of this young man. We are, of course, talking about John Ronald Reuel, or J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien watched in trepidation as his compatriots and friends enlisted in the war effort. In a letter he'd later write to his son, he recalled, "In those days, chaps joined up or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in for a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage." Although Tolkien was able to enter a program of delayed enlistment and finish his degree at Oxford, the day inevitably came when it was time to switch out his cap and gown for a helmet and gun. But at least he had his friends, his three besties from grade school who'd enriched each other's lives with a shared passion for art and fellowship and tea, lots of tea. Their names were Christopher, GB, and Rob, and they nicknamed him Tollers. Together, they called themselves the TCBS, Tea Club Barovian Society, and all of them would face this next journey of their adult lives in solidarity. They'd all enlisted. At least they had each other. But they were sent to different frontiers. Tolkien found himself in with the Lancashire Fusiliers in France and would fight in the Battle of the Somme. One can only imagine the scenes this sensitive young scholar of languages and literature witnessed from the trench warfare of no man's land, whose fleeting mortality was the sole focus of every waking, shaking moment. 5 months later, the British advanced a mere 5 miles at a cost of 420,000 British lives. What might experiencing this battlefield have been like, though, for Tolkien as an early adult? And how might it have echoed across the fiction he'd later write in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy? In a 1916 letter, he admitted that the dead marshes and the approaches to Morin owe something to northern France after the Battle of the Somme. This refers a narrative found in The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, Book 4, Chapter 2, The Passage of the Marshes, where Gollum guides Frodo and Samwise through the dead marshes as they approach the Black Gate of Mordor. Let's have a listen from the book itself. Dreary and wearisome, cold, clammy winter still held sway in this forsaken country. The only green was the scum of livid weed on the dark, grassy surfaces of sullen waters. Dead grasses and rotting weeds loomed up in the mists like ragged shadows of long-forgotten summers. Hurrying forward again, Sam tripped, catching his foot in some old root or tussock. He fell and came heavily on his hands, which sank deep into sticky ooze. For a moment, the water below him looked like a window, glazed with grimy glass, through which he was peering. Wrenching his hand out of the bog, he sprang back with a cry. "There are dead things, dead faces in the water," he said with horror. "Dead faces!" Frodo later adds, "They lie in all the pools, pale faces deep, deep under the dark water. I saw them, grim faces and evil, noble faces and sad. Many faces, proud and fair, and weeds in their silver hair, but all foul, all rotting, all dead." There's much to speculate on how Tolkien's first experiences as a soldier impacted his writing. And for all you true Tolkien heads out there, there's a whole biographical study that arose from a single observation. How strange it is that J.R.R. Tolkien embarked upon his monumental mythology in the midst of the First World War, the crisis of disenchantment that shaped the modern era. The biography is called Tolkien and the Great War, The Threshold of Middle-earth by John Garth. But henceforth, the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to hone in on one facet of the Tolkien universe that concerns us most, the trolls. Welcome to the Tolkien Troll Survey. We'll be looking at 4 types that show up in his stories: cave trolls, hill trolls, stone trolls, and Oleg High. Disclaimer, for those of you who are Tolkien fanatics, and I know you're out there, I will say this survey may not quench your unquenchable thirst, insatiable madness for all things Tolkien. I'm amazed by your loyalty to this man. And so I'm just letting you know, I know that there are other trolls out there. They are not featured here, but I'm recognizing that they do exist. So, for the dilettantes, let's dive in. Take a minute to check out this chart on our first troll, cave trolls. It identifies the work of which this troll first appears, some plot points, and some traits. I'm going to give you a minute to look at it, and then we'll talk about it. The images on the right are from two different sources. The top one will look familiar to you, as it's from a 2001 film, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. The bottom image is from one of several dozen Tolkien-themed board games out there. This one's called Middle-earth Strategy Battle Game. The images reflect the plot point highlighted in the table. Gandalf and his traveling companions, a motley crew of humans, hobbits, an elf, and a dwarf, must travel through the chamber of Mazarbul to get to their final destination. But in the chamber, Gandalf warns them there is something else, a great cave troll, I think, or more than one. There is no hope of escape that way. Despite this, Boromir convinces him that there is no better choice, and so they enter the chamber and face the trolls. What I appreciate most about Tolkien's narrative around cave trolls, and why I'm starting with this type in particular, are the myriad connective fibers to trolls of Nordic mythology and folklore. As you can see from image right, there is a conflict between the cave troll and the protagonist, who in this case is a hobbit named Frodo Baggins. Frodo Baggins has found himself knowingly trespassing inside the home of the cave troll inside this mountain. Frodo is vulnerable to danger because he's exited the existential security of the human world or human hobbit world outside, and that trolls do not play by the same rules in their dominion. Everybody knows that. Let me borrow a tale from Nordic folklore to share a comparison. On image left is an illustration of a key plot point to the story of Peer Gynt, a story which would later be transformed into a popularly acclaimed play in 1867 by Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, and with an unforgettable score by composer Edvard Grieg. In this moment of the story, Per has found himself in a compromising situation in the human world outside, compromising situation, because he must enter the cave in the mountain to find Dovre Gubben, which translates to Mountain King or King of the Trolls. He knows that by entering the cave, he's taking on a huge risk, and he might not get out alive. Unlike Frodo Baggins, Peer Gynt faces Dovre Gubben alone and is surrounded by the Mountain King's troll subjects, who chomp at his ankles and claw at his clothes. At least Frodo has his traveling companions to safely secure passage from the troll's chamber safely. So be it cave troll or Dovre Gubben, it's a troll of intimidating size, stature, and who has a cavernous dominion inside a mountain with a clear threshold that humans and hobbits should heed. Now take a minute to check out hill trolls on your own. Both the images on the right are approximations of what hill trolls might look like, according to the makers of the card games they're featured in. To seek out hill trolls, you really gotta wade into the weeds of Tolkien's texts. They actually only appear in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings as a way of creating a backstory for why this one character, Aragorn, has old beef with trolls in general. 2 generations prior to the action found in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, a hill troll killed Aragorn's grandfather, Eredor. Aragorn is human, as was his grandfather. And this tragic tale, that of a hill troll, a different race altogether, killing Aragorn's grandfather, being passed down from father to son, can sow the poison seeds of a revenge plot with the younger generations. In fact, in Old Norse mythology exists a classic binary between humans and trolls, or rather, humans versus trolls. It's like there's some original sin that trolls committed way back when that they can never atone for. So they'll always be the natural enemy of humans. But the trouble is, there is no written record for this original sin. In the Edda, which is the oldest source in Old Norse mythology, there is no original story of trolls messing up so bad that they deserve to be the bad guy forevermore with humans, bludgeoned to death by future generations forevermore. And so I wonder. And so I wonder, this incident of Eredor's death by hill troll, the fact that it appears in the appendix of the last book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Return of the King, it's at the very, very end of it all. Did Tolkien write this hill troll story in retrospect of his Middle-earth mythology in order to reflect the very same humans versus trolls distinction from Old Norse, that trolls are bad and deserve the infinitesimal revenge that they receive across the trilogy? The hill troll slaying of Eredor is the postscript recorded original sin. Maybe. Superfan shout out. For those of you Tolkien heads out there, if you're craving to hear more about this particular hill troll backstory, satiate yourself by checking out this fan-funded and fan-produced Born of Hope for free on YouTube. British filmmaker Kate Madison spent her life savings of £8,000 to produce the film with the goal of keeping the storytelling of Middle-earth alive and submitting the work to a Tolkien fan film exhibition. Once word got out that Madison wanted to turn the appendix into a full feature film, she ended up fundraising an additional £17,000. The film is available for free on YouTube and has been viewed 50 million times. Next up, stone trolls. A minute to check it out. The image on the top right is an illustration of the story of the stone trolls by Tolkien himself. He illustrated that. Image bottom right is a still from the 2012 film, The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. Some key features that set stone trolls apart from other trolls we've met thus far is that they are nocturnal and turn to stone once exposed to light. They are verbose and speak a language called Westron, but despite having language, they are quite dim-witted, which compels their doom. When we meet the stone trolls in The Hobbit, they come as three: Bert, Tom, and Bill. Already, there are parallels to be found in Nordic folklore. I'll take one tale off the shelf for comparison: the boys who met the trolls in the Hedal woods. This can be found in Norwegian folktales by Petter Kresten Asbjornsen and Jørgen Moe. In the folktale, two boys ventured out into the woods but strayed too far from the path. As darkness encroached, they used their hatchet to build a fire and make shelter of pine branches with moss for a bed. "Good night," they said, "better luck in the morning." Not long after the boys had closed their eyes did they hear something snuffing and snorting, and the earth shook as something advanced closer and closer, and the boys suddenly heard a loud, booming voice say, "I smell the smell of Christian blood here." Behold, the forest trolls had arrived, a trio to be exact, sharing one eye between them, and they were hungry for human flesh. What were the boys to do? Well, let's see what Bilbo and his friends did in their story. The group finds themselves hungry and unhappy, trying to make camp in a wet forest. Upon seeing a fire, Bilbo goes to investigate and finds three stone trolls roasting mutton and complaining of having no humans to eat. They catch Bilbo spying on them, capture him, and then spend a fair amount of time disagreeing amongst themselves of what to do next. Enter Balin the human and the dwarves, Bilbo's traveling companions, coming to fight the trolls and save the day. Trouble is, they get caught and tied to a spit, ready to be live roasted over a fire. Tastier than mutton indeed. So in both stories, our protagonists find themselves deep in a forest, are about to die by reason of inherent deliciousness, by a trio of trolls, of whom speak their intentions clearly, but we know there's a catch. Despite their eloquence, these trolls are dumb. In The Boys in the Hedal Woods, the boys escape death by playing a trick. They render the trolls unable to enjoy their food by catching one off balance and capturing the single eyeball that all three use to see. Without their eye, the trio is completely blind, and the power shifts in the boys' favor. The trolls beg for the eyeball back, offering gold and precious gems in reparations for their initial transgressions. The boys agree and exit the woods with a fortune and their lives. In the case of Bilbo and company, however, Bilbo leans into the trolls' hunger, sharing that his traveling companions, raw and bound to the spit, won't taste very good because they're infected with worms. Yuck. So, a discussion about proper spicing agents occurs. Long enough for Gandalf to arrive with a rising sun as the wizard faces the trolls and declares, "The dawn will take you all!" And so it does. The sun's first rays turn the trolls to stone, thus stone trolls. As you know, Tolkien illustrated the image bottom left himself. The image on the top right was colorized for a special Tolkien calendar in 1979. And actually, we'll experience an even more vivid rendering of this story later. Sneak peek, it will come from Tolkien's own voice himself. That experience later. For now, the last troll in our Tolkien troll survey, Oleg High. Take a minute to check this out for yourself. What I find most compelling about this particular troll is the fact that it was created by selective breeding. Olog-hai were made in a Middle-earth petri dish by Sauron, the ultimate evil genius out there. Selectively breeding trolls consisted of identifying and including desirable traits like strength, scales, claws, the ability to speak, and disincluding undesirable characteristics like vulnerability to the sun, a low IQ, and being able to communicate with other beings, as Sauron only wanted Olog-hai to communicate with him using his black speech. Sauron's intention was to create a super beast with no ability to communicate and thereby empathize with other beings, and he did just that. Sauron's selective breeding methods have parallels to a movement in Tolkien's era which was reaching its apex by the time the author had finished his military service: eugenics. Eugenics was a moralistic theory cloaked as one as racial biology, whose aim was to improve humanity by selectively mating people with desirable hereditary traits and breeding out people with so-called undesirable characteristics. As World War I came to a close with approximately 22 million deaths, eugenics and racial biology would play a major role in the next world war shortly to come after. But back in 1916, Tolkien's best friend Rob Gilson, from the days of the Tea Club Barovian Society, which must have felt like a lifetime ago, wrote a letter to his father to describe a deserted and overgrown garden that he had seen in La Boisselle, France, where his battalion was stationed in the run-up to the Battle of the Somme. According to author John Garth in Tolkien and the Great War, The Threshold of Middle-earth, Gilson walked amongst the flowers and saw larkspur and Canterbury bells and cornflowers and poppies of every shade and kind growing in the tangled mass. This wild flora was, he commented, one of the few really lovely things that the devastation of war produces. There are many grand and awe-inspiring sights. Guns firing at night are beautiful if they were not so terrible. They have the grandeur of thunderstorms. But how one clutches at the glimpses of peaceful scenes. It would be wonderful to be 100 miles from the firing line once again. Gilson wrote no valedictions. Pacing among the tents behind the ruins, on one of those wet and muddy nights, he wrote a friend, "It is no use harrowing people with farewell letters. It is not as if we were prodigal sons. Those who survive can write all that is necessary." Robert Quilter Gilson would be hit by a shell on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. He did not survive. Those who survive can write all that is necessary. Tolkien believed this to be true. In storytelling, there's fellowship that extends across time. You speak on behalf of those departed to celebrate their name, to preserve their wisdom, and to inspire new applications of their life's work. Such is the case in a scene that I would like to present to you. It's our final adventure for tonight within the Tolkien universe, and it appears in the adventures of Tom Bombadil and other verses from the Red Book. The Red Book being the legendarium of Middle-earth, composed by hobbits, whose historical records are kept. In this scene, we find Samwise Gamgee, several hobbits, and Aragorn resting in the shade of the stone trolls. Yes, the very same stone trolls that you just heard about. This scene takes place a generation after Bilbo Baggins tricked them into staying out past dawn, turning them into stone. So Samwise decides to recite a poem that satirizes the story of these trolls. And in doing so, he teaches his companions a piece of their history that they hadn't heard before. The poem is called, what else? The Stone Troll. And we're going to listen to it right now. But before I press play, a final note to complete our musings on connections between the Great War and the characters of Middle-earth. Tolkien wrote to a fan in 1956 that my Samwise is indeed largely a reflection of the English soldier, grafted on the village boys of early days, the memory of the privates and my Batman that I knew in the 1914 war and recognized as so far superior to myself. With that in mind, here is J.R.R. Tolkien reciting himself the poem as Samwise Gamgee in a 1952 recording at his friend's house in Worcestershire. Here are the lyrics. You can read along as you like. I do not own the rights to the recording. Enjoy.
Standing up with his hands behind his back as if he was in school, he began to sing to an old tune. The trolls sat alone on his seat of stone and munched and mumbled of their own bone. For many a year it near for me 'twas hard to come by, some by, gum by. In a cave in the hills he dwelt alone, and me 'twas hard to come by. Up came John with his big boots on, says he to the troll, pray what is yon? For it looks like the shin of an Uncle Jim, as should be a lying in graveyard, caveyard, paveyard. This many a year has Jim been gone, and I thought he were lying in graveyard. My lad said, troll, this bone I stole, but what be bones that lie in a hole? Thine uncle was dead as a lump of lead afore I found his carcass. Harkee, markee, you can spare a bone for a poor old troll, he's got no use for his carcass. Said John, I don't see what the likes of thee, with an axe and leave should go making free, with a leg of the shin of my father's skin, so hand the old bone over, rover, trover, though dead he be, belongs to he, so hand the old bone over. For a couple of pins, as the troll and grins, I'll eat thee too and gnaw thy shins. A bit of fresh meat will go down sweet. There'll be a nice change from thine uncle, sunkle, drunkle. I'm tired of gnawing old bones and skins. There'll be a nice change from thine uncle. But just as he thought his dinner was caught, he found his hands had hold of naught. Before he could mind, John slipped behind and gave him the boot to larn him, warn him, darn him. A bump of the boot in the seat, John thought, would be the way to larn him. But harder than stone is the flesh and bone of a troll that sits in the hills alone. As well set your boot to the mountain's root, for the seat of a troll don't feel it, deal it, peel it. Old troll laughed, but John did groan, for his poor toes did feel it. John's leg is game since home he came, and his bootless foot is lasting lame. But troll don't care, and he's still there, with a bony bone from its owner, donor, boner. Troll's old seat is still the same, with a bony bone from its owner.
It's time to switch gears and explore our second troll artist of the presentation. It's time to travel to Finland. If you don't already know, Finnish history varies widely from its Scandinavian neighbors. Broadly speaking, Finnish history can be divided into 3 chapters. The Swedish period prior to 1809, the Russian period from 1809 to 1917, and the independent period from 1917 to the present day. Each of these periods would play a role in the character development of a girl born in Helsinki in 1914. This girl was named Tove Jansson. Both of Jansson's parents were members of the Swedish-speaking minority of Finland. Her father, Victor, was a sculptor, and her mother, Senia, was a graphic artist. And thus, Jansson was raised in an environment where there was little distinction between the world of home and the world of the studio, one's work. She started drawing at an early age, even publishing her first picture book at 14. By 1929, 15-year-old Jansson joined her mother as an illustrator at Garm, an anti-fascist satirical magazine written in both Swedish and Finnish, which we'll touch on in a bit. One can only imagine the stimuli a young artist would be exposed to during the interwar period of the 1930s. Finland had just gained independence from Imperial Russia and was coming of age as a modern country, just as Jansson came of age as a young woman. From Finland, she traveled. She spent years abroad at several art schools, starting with the University College of Arts, Crafts, and Design in Stockholm, Sweden. There, she lived with her grandparents, and the legend goes, she was always hungry. According to Professor Lotta Gavel-Adams at the University of Washington, at night, Jansson would sneak down to the kitchen and raid the pantry. One time, her uncle caught her and told her that behind the shelves in the pantry there lived the Moomin trolls. They looked like ghosts and had eyes like little raisins. And they would blow cold air down the back of your neck if you came down to sneak a snack. Moomin trolls, Jansson must have thought at the time. But she didn't outright dismiss the experience. And it would come back again many years later in a big way. For the time being, one thing was for sure. Jansson was still hungry. The kind of hunger that seeps into the soul within and compels the soles of your feet to go forth, to travel further. Southward she went, seeking to strengthen her skills as an artist. She visited family in Velbert, Germany, and the mood of daily life shifted. She toured Nuremberg. She noticed an eerie, widespread nationalist sentiment and illustrated it in her notebook. Here, she presents a distinctly hostile city. According to ToveJansson.com, the image of Germany she creates is far from romanticized. In a short letter, in the short story brevet called The Letter, she expresses the horrors of life in Munich through the impoverished and unhappy Mr. Vopel, who has sunk into a gray cloak of meaninglessness. Unable to afford travel, he looks enviously upon the happy globetrotters at the train station. Jansson left Mr. Vopel at the train station and exited Germany, disturbed by the experience and seeking brighter inspiration. In fact, she wished to study again. She landed in Paris. L'Essai. So many schools to choose from. In fact, Paris was the place that her parents, Senia and Victor, had met for the first time as young Nordic art students. However, Jansson was not the type to follow tradition for tradition's sake. She eschewed the hoity-toity écoles of the city for more radical ateliers. In a letter to her mother in the spring of 1938, she wrote, "Let me tell you, Paris is definitely the right place to deal a blow to the final vestiges of one's inferiority complex. One simply has to get over it to survive. If you are the least bit shy, compliant, apologetic, or anxious, you end up feeling like a doormat before the day is over." Jansson expanded on this newfound vibrance in another letter, sharing a hand-drawn map of the city and the exclamation, "Here in Paris, you can't be afraid of color. It sparkles everywhere. Every little tobacconist's is painted in its own cheery shade, and the air makes everything even more brilliant and alive. Like generations of artists and intellectuals before her, Jansson spent time rubbing elbows at Le Dome Cafe. One night, the mood soured when a group of Finnish nationalists arrived at her table. They referred to themselves as so-called genuine Finns, and Jansson was disgusted. She wrote to her family, "I didn't say a word for an hour and a half, but then I couldn't hold it in any longer, and I told them it was a curse of the world, these restrictive boundaries, this racial hatred, this linguistic baiting, this petty you can't play in our yard, this ludicrous labeling, and next time they showed any tendency to start hacking on about politics, I would just get up and leave." And so, Jansson left. Paris, that is. It was time to move on. She was still hungry for broader experiences, and so traveled further south, to Italy, eating up as much ancient and Renaissance art as she could find. She discovered as much about her sexual preferences as she did about her artistic ones. Jansson loved women. She identified as lesbian. And although 1930s Europe wasn't necessarily a hospitable environment to identify as LGBTQ, she would meet other lesbian artists who inspired her thirst for further creative outlets. But somewhere out there, a clock was ticking, anticipating a turning. Tick-tock. She wrote to her mother, "I have succeeded in liberating myself from the urge to paint loud pictures just to impress." Tick-tock. "Today I was at the museum and noted with certain satisfaction that I no longer got stuck in front of every canvas, but calmly walked past things that did not fit my way of seeing." Tick-tock. "And I knew for sure what I liked and what I could learn from." Dong, dong, dong. The party was over. It was 1939 and Germany invaded Poland. World War II officially began. Jansson collected her memories and returned to Helsinki. She struggled to find footing as a painter. She even questioned her artistic ambitions, which was exacerbated by the context of the times. She said, "During the war, one's work stood still. It felt completely pointless to try to create pictures." And indeed, Finland during the Second World War was a very confusing place to be. When Soviet bombs fell over the city of Helsinki, the Finns launched a defensive winter war against their eastern neighbor, the very same neighbor who they had only just recently seceded from after 100+ years of occupation. Whether it be former Tsarist Russia or the newer Soviet Union, the Finns were absolutely not to be annexed again. History would not repeat itself here, folks. This meant that the Finnish government found itself in an uneasy alliance with Nazi Germany, buying firearms from them even. Then 1941 happened. Hitler invaded the USSR, and now Stalin's shaking hands with the US and the UK? What whiplash! And where does that leave us, thought the Finns? How utterly maddening to be making sense of these events, to choose a side, the Axis or the Allies, when both are belligerent towards you. Jansson's family life fell apart due to differing political positions on the war, as you can see here in her oil painting called Family. According to ToveJansson.com, the painting's atmosphere is distorted, and she tries to fix it with color. Victor, Jansson's father, has pro-German inclinations, and his painful memories of the Finnish Civil War. He fought against the Bolsheviks in 1918 when Tove Jansson was a young child, and it puts a strain on the whole family. With Jansson's brother Per Olav fighting on the Eastern Front of the Second World War, the family is steeped in worry. Warfare seems like a game of chess. The family becomes increasingly divided politically. Jansson broods over a woman's lot. She stands in opposition of her father's opinions and finds the war empty of meaning. She has fallen in love with a female left-wing artist, which is not to her father's liking. When men stop killing, then I will bear a child, but I know that they will never stop. She writes and vents her frustration in caricatures and politically daring illustrations for the magazine Garm. Garm took a stand against political issues using satire, and fascism of any form was often in its scope. On this Garm cover illustration, Jansson portrays Adolf Hitler as a child who is throwing a temper tantrum. Mehr Kacke, he cries, more cake. Surrounding Hitler are the political leaders of Europe trying to appease him as a spoiled child. There's a cornucopia of desserts being offered at the table. They're labeled as the geographic regions of Alsace-Lorraine, the Polish corridor, countries like Romania and Yugoslavia, but Hitler wants more. And that featured cake in the center, why, it's the whole world. Since Nazism and communism were often targets, Jansson's illustrations at Garm came under scrutiny and even censorship. But she was undeterred and continued taking on controversial matters in her work. She even said once that it was fun to be able to be swinish towards Hitler and Stalin. In this featured cover, we see a two-paneled comic of Joseph Stalin. Here he is, ready for battle. Even Stalin's pet pooch at the bottom left frame fears the man's masculine prowess. Look at that oversized scabbard, the dog is thinking, trembling for the sword about to be unsheathed. Stalin draws his sword from the scabbard, and lo and behold, it's teeny tiny. The pet pooch explodes with laughter. Looks like someone was overcompensating. Also featured here circled is the artist's signature, Tove. But for real, why is his sword so small? Notice the text above the illustration. There's for, F-O-R-E, as in before, and on the left, ook efter, as in and after, on the right. This after refers to the peace negotiations between the USSR and Finland, occurring at the time in order to end the Winter War between them. A bilateral treaty was on the table, and thus Jansson's illustration was censored. For the picture to be approved, she actually had to change Stalin's physicality and give him a bushy beard so that he might be interpreted as any typical Russian soldier. These redactions bristled her immeasurably. Outside her door, Helsinki was pockmarked by Moscow's aggression. But since the USSR was now preoccupied with German occupation, they were on the defensive. Leningrad, a Soviet city close to the Finnish border, was very exposed, and some Finns thought, why are we signing a peace treaty? Who's to say that this isn't the time to take advantage, storm in, and push our border eastward? This idea actually gained popular appeal. For a long time, Finnish ambitions were to take control of the region around Leningrad, called Karelia, featured on the bottom right of the map in red. Karelia to this day holds special significance to the Finns due to its connection with the 19th century literature and music movement. Well, in the end, cooler heads prevailed as Finnish leadership realized that if they launched an offensive, there would be no hope of Finnish-Soviet diplomacy after the war ended. Both sides signed the peace treaty in 1940, and the Winter War was over. And in retrospect, it was a smart move. As many historians today, like Dr. Stephen S. Koblik of California Lutheran University, claim that the survival of the Finnish state after World War II and during the upcoming Cold War is one of remarkable and highly unlikely success stories of the 20th century. If the Finns had attempted to take Karelia, who knows what would have happened to their autonomy during the Cold War. But back to Garm and back to Jansson. In this last cover I'm sharing with you today, you'll see the artist responding to the censorship that she encountered, as well as revisionist history. This censoring was a kind of revisionist history that she responded to. As World War II on the European stage drew to a close, a period of social reorientation of war criminals began. Here you see an enormous, powerful machine in the center of the image. It's a pacification machine. Nazis walk through the entrance on the right, their features scraggly, dark, with long noses. These characteristics are washed and discarded through a chimney. What comes out at the top of the machine is unrecognizable from what went inside. They're angels, wearing halos, playing harps, and floating gracefully back down to earth. Now fully assimilated back into civil society, the pacified war criminal on the bottom sniffs a delicate flower and extends a hand of rebuke to the monstrous qualities and actions from whence it came. It's truly a spectacle to behold. And there's one more element in this image that I'd like you to notice, which makes it a distinctly Jansonian creation. Who is this? And who is that? Tiny creatures, one of which is looking out at us. Meet Snork, Jansson's alter ego, who appeared in many of the caricatures and cover images that she illustrated for Garm. Snork became a means for Jansson to connect directly with her readership and let them know that she too was aware of the grim realities of war, but wished to prevent herself from falling into complete despair. Through Snork, Jansson found an outlet that would preserve her sanity. According to the New Yorker article inside of Tove Jansson's private universe, she wrote to a friend during this time, "Characters took shape in my mind when I was feeling depressed and scared of the bombing and wanted to get away from the gloomy thoughts to something else entirely. I crept into this unbelievable world where everything was natural and benign and possible." She built this world and named it Moomin Valley, where all sorts of colorful creatures commingled amongst each other and solved the riddles of daily life with tolerance and courage. And at the center of the Moomin world was its protagonist, Snork. Actually, she changed Snork's name to Moomin Troll. Moomin Troll is quite the character. And unlike other trolls you've met before, he's agreeable, sensitive, and curious. Even physically, he has less in common with the classic trolls of Nordic folklore than he does with a bipedal baby hippopotamus. And unlike the solitary trolls of yesteryear, Moomin Troll has a whole lot of friends. First, his parents. You have the practical and conciliatory Moomin Mama, who wears an apron and carries a purse, and the philosophical yet slightly narcissistic Moomin Papa, who wears a top hat and carries a walking stick. Critics have wondered over the years whether these Moomin parents were inspired by Jansson's human parents. As Jansson wrote these characters into stories with an intended children's readership, the world, Moomin Troll's world, expanded. Here are the inhabitants of Moomin Valley. I'm going to pause my narration for a moment for you to look for yourself and see if you recognize any of them. As I said before, these are trolls of a completely different caliber and level of danger than what readers experienced in Nordic folklore and fairy tales for children. They are not really trolls in a traditional sense. They're not scary, but they did grow out of a pretty scary environment. And we're gonna see what that looks like right now. This is the culmination of everything that you've learned about the socio-political circumstances of Tove Jansson and how they influenced a new lineage of trolls. Here is her very first Moomin troll story published in 1945 called The Moomins and the Great Flood. This animated short comes from an article on Moomin.com, and it's called The Shadow of War in the First Moomin Story. I do not own the rights to the film. Enjoy.
It must have been late in the afternoon, one day at the end of August, when Moomin Troll and his mother arrived at the deepest part of the great forest. It was completely quiet, and so dim between the trees that it was as though twilight had already fallen. Here and there giant flowers grew, glowing with a peculiar light like flickering lamps, and furthest in, among the shadows, moved tiny dots of cold green. Glowworms, said Moomin Mama. But they had no time to stop and take a closer look at them. They were out, searching for a snug, warm place where they could build a house to crawl into when winter came.
She wrote it in the beginning of the 1940s, during the war, the Winter War. And at that time she was very busy doing political cartoons in a magazine called J.R.R. And in Garms she used a sort of double signature named Tove, and then she created a little figure that she called Nordic. And that's an early version, you can say, of a Moomin troll. And then this signature stepped into a story, you might say. There's homelessness, and there's a threat of annihilation, also the catastrophe. Of course, the Great Flood. There are refugees in this story, so you can see how the war, I think, have influenced her. But then there's a happy end. It's a children's book, after all. She says in her diaries, we dreamed about a construction of a happy society and another world. And perhaps you might say that the Moomin world is a form of realization of this dream. A very important purse plays a very important part in this book, because in this purse she has things that you might need unexpectedly. There's chocolate, but there's aspirin, and there's also a corkscrew. She uses it to open a bottle that the father has put in the sea, to where he says SOS, because he wants them to come to rescue him. She saves the family, you might say. In the beginning it's a mother and her son, and then they meet a little animal, it's Sniff, and he gets into the family, and that's very typical for the Moomin family. It's a very flexible concept. And also, you must care for others. There's a scene in this book where Moomin Mama and Moomin Troll, they're saving a cat and her kittens, and that's very important to them, because it's a mother like herself.
The thing that was lurching towards them was an upholstered armchair. Sometimes it got caught in the treetops that stuck up out of the water, but was pulled free by the current and went drifting on. In the chair sat a wet cat with 5 equally wet kittens around her. "Poor mother," cried Moomin Mama, and she jumped out into the water all the way up to her waist. "Hold on to me and I'll try to catch them with my tail."
This story is about a family who is divided and is trying to get together again. And they have no home and they're trying to find somewhere to live. And that's a story you can read about every day, all the time. So it's timeless.
So we're at the end, and I want to leave you with a final quote. Sami writer Linda Kerp said, "Art has a voice. It is created with the imagination, and it is just as much a part of the human makeup as are the tongue, the mouth, larynx, and lungs with which we speak. Art heightens our awareness of the world around us, and it can say something about what society is doing, what it has done, and it is capable of doing. A free society is kept in check by critics and visionaries, some of whom are artists." Thank you for listening. Good night. Bora ija tak. And here are my sources.